So Ukraine is 4 years into the war. 24th of Feb marked the anniversary, which is 4 years since the Russian full-scale invasion. Now, this was a defining geopolitical event that set Europe on its current path: rearmament, sovereign capabilities, the transatlantic disentanglement, all of the stuff that we cover on this pod. Now, we wouldn't be talking about this had the war not started. And having spent a little time in Ukraine last year, what's been on my mind beyond this horrific human tragedy is what's changed at government, at infrastructure, at the commercial level, and what will remain once the war is over. So a little bit of context just to kick off the conversation. This week we saw Frankenberg and Titan both raise 30 mil to their two European air defense startups. Same thesis: air defense, it must be cheap, it must be fast, it must be highly available. The NATO Innovation Fund backed them. Now, a semi-question, but we'll come back to it, is this the institutional money into defense tech we've been waiting for? There is also the 800 billion euro rearm Europe plan. EIB's defense spending quadrupled to 4 billion in 25. More broadly, Ukraine is pivoting from the recipient of aid to a strategic capabilities supplier. Ukrainian defense tech startups raised 105 million in 25, roughly a third of all European early-stage defense tech capital. Now, a bit of context there, but Lomax, I've got so many questions around this. I guess the first one is something around, is this defense wave real or still mostly announcements? How would you break it down?
I think we're at the beginning of a secular shift here in Europe. So there's not only what's happened in Ukraine, which I don't think you mentioned, is also what's happened in the White House, right? And I don't want to maybe dwell on this because we've talked about this a lot before, but we've had the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and then we've had Trump coming in saying, look, this is not going to continue. We're not going to continue underwriting. You've been underspending on defense and in Europe, and the US is not going to continue underwriting that anymore. So you guys have got to get your act together. You've got to increase your spending as a percentage of GDP on defense. Historically, the European countries have lapsed down to 1.5% of GDP. Remember that the NATO target was 2%. Now we're all talking about a 5% target by 2035, right? UK is trying to get to 3% by the end of this parliament. But ultimately, these numbers are changing in a kind of secular way. So I think from a defense spending point of view, that is only going to continue. Now, just think historically, the US would spend roughly $1 trillion on defense. Europe was spending about a quarter to a third of that. That gap is going to, the US may continue actually to grow, but the European and the UK defense budgets are going to go from something like 300 billion to 600 billion over the next 5, 6, 7 years, right? So that is a big seismic shift. Now, don't forget, that's total budget. And that includes everything that goes into personnel, recruitment, barracks, logistics. Only a small percentage of that goes into technology, which is obviously our world. But let's say 5 to 10% of that goes into R&D and technology. There's a few things that are colliding. We have the threat of Russia, which isn't really going away, obviously as evidenced by Ukraine, but also potentially threats to other states on the east of Europe. We have the US's statement of intent around no longer underwriting European defense. And then we have the technological shifts now, AI, autonomous systems, etc., that require effectively ripping out and replacing a lot of the old instruments of war that we've had before. And I think we're only at the beginning of that. If you actually look at the numbers, investment into defense tech in Europe in 2019 was $100 million per year. Now it's like last year it was 1.5 billion. So we've gone up, 15 times in 6 years, right? As a result of all of those things. Now you have lighthouse companies. You have Helsing, valued at 12 billion, raised 600 million last year. You have Stark Robotics. You have Quantum Systems that are both raised, at least $100 million rounds last year. So you have companies raising real money. Those companies are also doing deals with governments now, very early, right? They actually, if you look through the details of the number of UK and European defense tech companies that have actually signed seismic deals with the European government is actually quite small at the moment, but it's going to happen. And actually, once these policies have been put in place, they kind of, defense spending is expected to grow, 10% year on year over the next 7, 8 years. So I feel like that is an opportunity for startups. A little bit of cold water, but perspective is that the US is also doing this in a big, big way, right? And Dural now, the kind of their own lighthouse, new prime, new tech defense tech company, is in talks to raise a $6 billion round at the moment. They raised a $2.5 billion round, I think, last year. So the numbers again, it's like reminds me of OpenAI and the LLMs. Like the numbers are very, very different Europe, US. But if you just zoom in on Europe, there are opportunities here. Now, I think finally, as a venture investor, I often think about this because I have made investments in defense and I have made investments in dual use. Is one of the worst things you can do in venture is start writing checks into things that I call, current soup du jour. It's like investing in health during COVID. It's investing in the current thing. You want to be investing 3-4 years ahead. And one thing I'm still trying to figure out is, in defense, are you at the risk of the same thing? But I sometimes think actually not, because actually there's so long to go in terms of the integration of these new technologies, in terms of the reindustrialization of the European military industrial base complex, that actually there is a lot of opportunity there.
No, I mean, thanks for opening the topic, Dan. And I think Lomax talks a lot about sort of the details and the implications, but I do think it is worth just stopping up and considering how different of a world we are in today. If you go back 4 years, I mean, we had 2022, Europe, security was guaranteed by the US. Our automotive industry was seen as the world leader. We had the cheap Russian gas, completely reliant on US tech, and sort of thought that that's going to remain that way forever. Now, all those things are just they're gone now. And at the same time, we have China that's been catching up in an incredible way, both on the automotive front, but also on the AI front, which is kind of the automotive side is terrifying the European industrial base. The AI front is terrifying the Americans. And so the Americans are pivoting out of Europe and sort of, there's this US-Chinese belligerence, and we're still trying to figure out what our response should be in Europe. And I think there's a risk that we are overrun on the manufacturing side and the AI side simultaneously. So the stakes are really existential, and that means we can't have an incremental response. So I think that's the backdrop. The upside, if you will, is that we now have a license to put sort of those luxury beliefs we had to one side. We're going to come back to that later. I think we're going to talk about some of the AI companies and how they are changing their views in one of the next segments. But I think for us, it feels now we now have a license to focus on competition, on actually being the best at something, and not on getting distracted by these other extraneous activities that aren't really creating value, but we're just sort of navel gazing and doing other stuff. So I think that is possibly something positive that could come out of this. In terms of what's ahead for us, so if you think about Ukraine, so we're 4 years in, and Dan, you talked about the incredible human toll. I mean, I think is it 1.8 million people, sort of combined casualties on both sides? It's just, there's not been this level of war that we've seen since the Second World War, I think. And it's kind of a staggering number of people dying. And that's a big tragedy. And the question is, how do we resolve it? And I think we owe a lot to the Ukrainians for standing up to Russia. And the least we can do is to support them economically. And the Trump administration has obviously said, the US, we're out. And so as Europeans, we're the ones that are left to step up and step in. From what I can tell, the Ukraine needs about 60 billion kind of euros or dollars a year from partners to sustain the war effort. And Europe has been stepping up, but still only about 30 billion a year now. So there is a gap that needs to be closed to be able to sustain Ukraine. The Russian economy is struggling. I mean, growth has certainly collapsed completely, and it looks like they're going to go into the reverse. They've been, spending down of their sovereign wealth fund. The oil price for for Russian oil is very low. So there are real challenges ahead, but it doesn't look like this is going to be solved quickly. And so there is a real question of who's got the will to sustain this for longer. And I think it's very, very important that we stay in this and we continue to support Ukraine.
I was reading this week how the Ukrainians are measuring the financial impact they're having on Russia. And I can't remember the name of the metric, but they basically measure, they have like drones that destroy shipping. And so far their run rate is for every dollar they spend on whatever piece of kit, they're destroying $100 worth of Russian equipment. So I think obviously while they're operating at that 100x, I think hopefully there will be a point where the Russian war machine slowly runs out of steam. But I don't know. I have no context for how long that's going to take. But I do hope it's a relatively speedy close.
But wars are basically economics. Right? No, I would close like Mads rightly focuses on the terrible tragedy that's going on in Ukraine. I would say if you want to try and take some positives away from this going forwards, firstly, is Europe has had the wake up call that it needed probably in this regard, and is starting to spend. You look at the European rearm program by 2030, they want to spend 800 billion over 10 years. So that's real money. Secondly, is what's gone on in Ukraine is the Ukrainians are the most up to date, cutting edge. They are fighting a war of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And so actually that skill set, knowledge resides within Europe now, and actually not the US, for example. So there is, if I know Ukraine is not in the EU. It's partly why they're fighting.
Trying to be. He keeps asking, doesn't he? Yeah.
But let's just call, Ukraine Europe. And it is very integrated, obviously, at a military level with the rest of Europe and NATO. So I think that, I wouldn't call it exciting because it's probably the wrong word to use, but it's certainly compelling.
Yeah. There will be a legacy. There will be innovation,
well, I know it,
manufacturing, startups.
From our investments in defense, is they're deeply integrated with these absolutely crack Ukrainian teams, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah. I was in a drone factory last year looking at some of the tech they were building, and at that point they were buying in all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff from China, from different weird and wonderful tech pieces of kit to construct these drones. It was quite an eye opener. But
on that note, actually, there are two articles worth reading. One is the great article in The Guardian last weekend about the origins of the war and how the UK and the US saw it coming and no one would listen, not even the Ukrainians. Really, really good long read. And there's a good article actually in the FT today about exactly what you're saying, Dan, which is around, because one of the problems with defense is also just like scaling up these supply chains and actually manufacturing at scale and at speed. And actually in the context of modern warfare and drones, actually this stuff becomes obsolete incredibly quickly. So,
the rate of innovation is nuts.
So at one point, at one stage, you're like, we need to make loads of these things. But at the same time, it's like, really? But then we'll have a stockpile of stuff that's out of date. This is not like, this is not.
And also the Russians work out how to counter it, don't they? So they're using all the fiber optics. They're running 20, 30K fiber optics to run these drones. I was also reading about, I can't remember the name of the thing, they're like 2,000 kilo ships, the water drones that they used to go and basically run at the Russian fleets to sink the Russian ships, and how they've managed to work out how to get short-range missiles to fire from these tiny vessels while they're rocking around and all the salt water going into all the electrics. It's quite amazing stuff, although unbelievably horrific in the same breath.